Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday and welcome to February 7th, 2024. This is your Daily Detroit. We're going to jump into our conversation today after we thank our members on Patreon, patreon.com/Daily Detroit. Your support helps conversations like this happen. Let's get started. Coming to you from the Daily Detroit studio at Techtown, I'm Jared Stays, and our conversation today is with Tinu Usoro. And she is the education organizer from 482 Forward, as well as the organizing and training director for YVAC. So welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. So the basis of our conversation is going to be about education. And it doesn't take an expert to know that there are a variety of challenges going on. For the uninitiated or those who don't know your organization, what are the kind of key pain points that you all are working on right now?
I'll say for 482 Forward, right now, the biggest things that we're working on is like charter. So my charter committee. We know that charters in the city of Detroit, but across the nation, are not as transparent, are not as equitable as they present to be. So that's one of the biggest things. And how do we create a level of transparency and accountability within a charter system? Also, our youth are working on school facilities because why are students in school risking tiles falling on their head or bathrooms with no stall doors or food that is prison food? We're also working on being healed. So our Brightmore Be Healed campaign. Mental health is such a serious crisis in the city of Detroit, but it's also a crisis within Black people. And so Brightmore, our Be Healed campaign, and then for YVAC. So youth-led organization, all youth good stuff. But one of the things that is key is the fact that we have to bridge the gaps between education, our schools, our youth, but our families. And so one of the things that we do that is key to our work is our mutual aid work. And so it's that how do we make sure that people have clothes? How do we make sure that people in these conditions have hats and gloves and coats and money, rapid response if people are out homeless on the street or need a ride or need food? And so how do we partner with our organizations like Detroit Heals Detroit, who has like also a wellness center? We have a wellness center as well. We've turned that into a warming center in these conditions. And so like really just like all of these gaps that need to be filled that are not being filled due to all of the systemic things and making sure that we fill in those gaps.
So listeners know there are literally salt trucks driving by and snow piling up on cars as we're recording this. Very adverse conditions. How does that end up impacting education here in Detroit?
You know, it's funny that you asked that. So on my way in, my children go to a charter school, and we got a message this morning that there was no school. There hasn't been any school all week. Yesterday, I think they had school, but no school today because, of course, we're getting 6 inches of snow, right? But I saw that Northwestern High School was open. And one of the things that myself and my Uber driver was talking about was the fact that there were students walking to school in these conditions. How is that even possible? Like we're expecting 6 inches of snow with a -20 wind chill, and there are students walking to school because transportation in school is not a thing. It is not something that is the standard for Detroit public schools. These are like real conditions. And what about kids who don't have coats or hats or gloves or?
Explain for a lay listener how much transportation is not a thing.
I grew up in Florida, and our public school system, there was a bus for every neighborhood. Parents did not have to figure out how to get their kids to school. In Detroit, every school does not have a bus system. And so you either have to figure out how to get your kids to school, they have to take the city bus, they have to walk.
This is also true in some suburban districts as well.
Transportation should be something that is offered for every school, for every neighborhood, and it's not. And then you have all of the extra weeds of things like safe routes to school, which some routes to school are not safe.
You mentioned your kids go to charter school and that you deal a lot with charter schools. What is the percentage of kids that are going to charter schools in Detroit right now? And how big of the pie is it? Because there's so much focus on DPS, but charters are a big part of this thing, right?
Charters are a big part of this thing. And I don't have the exact number of how many kids are in charter school, but it's a lot. DPSCD's enrollment right now is at 53,000. Back in 1998, it used to be a little over 100,000. And so now that we're at 53,000, that means that the remainder of those kids are in charter schools or out of district.
That is one statistic I had seen, that I think it's more than half of Detroit kids do not go to Detroit public schools. They either go to a charter or schools of choice, which is, I'm sure, also complicating your mission and things because
it does.
It adds another layer of travel and complexity.
Yes, it does. I know moms who are taking kids to 5 different schools every day. So it does add a
5 schools.
5 different schools, yes. Because you also have to realize that because the state of schools, all schools is not going to educate your child the same way. And so you have to pay attention as a parent to the way that your kid learns, their needs, if they have IEPs or 504 plans, like those are needs, and some schools are not able to service those.
When you're talking about all those different needs, so that tells me that there's a pretty big gap between different school districts in Michigan. Is that right?
1,000%.
Another thing that I have learned in doing research around this is the frustrating fact that grade level achievement tends to track with household income of the district that it serves. How do you end up combating some of that? Because I got to imagine that between factors like that, and then also, let's say you're a Detroit resident with kids and you've got, kids going to different districts in the suburbs, that can't help with keeping population here. Because if your kid's going, I'm not trying to pick on anywhere specific, but let's say your kid's going somewhere in Ferndale or they're going somewhere in Southfield, you may want to be closer to where the schools are. So how's that all working together as far as an impact?
People want to live where their kids go to school. And so what you see is that people will move. When realtors show you a house, they show you the school district. And so people move based on where their kids need to go to school. It creates a gap in Detroit because quality schools that people feel are quality schools are not existent. And so I believe that our schools have all of the possibilities and all of the structures in place to be great schools, but there are so many systemic things. There's so many games to be played. There are like so many weeds of things that make our schools not great schools, and people have to leave. And when you think about things like DPSCD, we can't use our property tax money for schools, and we can't use them for facilities. We can't use them for infrastructure. But you have places like a Grosse Pointe Woods where they can get football fields donated.
Because they have a foundation for that, right? They have the additional resources that kick in because there's so much more to the school funding formula. We focus so much on the base amount, what we get from the state. But because of the way that the rules work, and I don't know if people without parents or people who don't dive into this know, that is very limited in what you can spend that on. But the ways that a community can support, they can't say raise money for more teachers. That actually is something that used to happen back in the 80s and 90s. I remember this. But what they can do is say, all right, that maintenance on that school, we're going to go ahead and take care of that so that is no longer part of your budget and no longer something you have to carry, which gives a number of districts. I mean, obviously we pick on Grosse Pointe because it's right there. It's right next to the city, but there are a number of districts who have that ability to, whether it's through foundations or sinking fund millages or other things, other tools to take that off of that. Whereas the tools to Detroit Public Schools for various reasons are kind of limited.
Exactly.
Now you mentioned about issues with charter schools. What are we seeing out there? Because so often in the news, I've seen things where, such and such public school is having an issue or whatever, but I don't see it as often in charter schools. And is that just a gap in reporting or people not thinking about that? Like, what are we seeing out there?
There's a huge gap in reporting.
Okay.
So transparency in charter schools is not a thing. People don't know who to go to, just the basic things. People don't know who to go to. So when you think of like public school, you know that Dr. Vidi is
there's a school board, like wherever you live,
a school board.
Right? You have a school board, you have a superintendent.
Yes.
Whether it's Dr. Vidi in Detroit or wherever you happen to be listening to this.
Yes.
There's a chain of accountability.
Yes. And there's no chain of accountability in charter schools. Yes, you have the colleges who are the authorizers. Then you have the education management companies who are like the overseers of the day-to-day operations of the schools. And then you have the administrative staff and so on. And then you also have the board in between the EMO and the authorizer. Most board meetings are not readily accessible. Parents don't know when board meetings are. They don't have access to board meetings. I've firsthand witnessed things like board meetings being changed because boards knowing that I'm coming to their meetings. So accountability is a huge, huge, huge gap when it comes to charter schools.
Now, aren't a large number of charter schools for-profit operations?
Absolutely.
So that is another thing where you have to add in a layer of profit on top of all the other money that you're taking in.
One of the bills that we're currently working on with State Representative Kolazar is an education management operation bill for transparency, meaning that they need to share their budget. Where is the money that you're getting going? Who's it going to, and what is your money being spent on? Because right now, you get money because most people don't know that charter schools are public school academies. They are public entities, but the weeds of things and the way that bills have been structured, they get to operate as private entities, and they are not.
Does this also create holes and gaps where maybe people who wouldn't necessarily be running a school would end up working at a charter school? Is there a different layer of, and I apologize for my naivete around this, but where there's a different level of qualification to work at a public versus a charter school?
Oh, 100%. They use Teach for America a lot in charter schools. And that's no disrespect to Teach for America, because their mission and vision is great. But you can't use Teach for America teachers, but you expect public schools to have certified teachers, but you use Teach for America. And what that does is now that causes teacher turnover rate, because Teach for America teachers are there for a year.
Right. That is designed as a improvement in Band-Aid program, not the permanent solution.
Exactly.
And are you seeing that there are districts, or there are charter districts or charter schools leaning on that?
100%. There's a charter district right now that is bringing people in from the Philippines to teach Black students.
Interesting. And now, does this reflect the teacher shortage overall?
It does. It does. Because one of the other bills that's on the floor is for teacher salary transparency. Because in charter schools, their salary is not transparent. And they're being paid different salaries at different rates. Some are qualified, some are not. And so it does.
Isn't there also a lack of unionization in those charter schools as well? Which is part of that whole thing, right? Because if you have a union contract with a public entity, you can go through, and if you really feel like spending your Saturday night this way, you can go through and see the contract and see the steps and see what's going on.
Yes, most charter schools do not have a union.
Okay. Now, with all of these other challenges, and you are the parent of charter school kids, why are people selecting charter schools like this?
Well,
and not to put heat on you, but
no, I've been a charter parent. My daughter is in 8th grade. She's been in charter school since kindergarten. And I think so in the beginning, the neighborhood that I lived in is Hope Village. Shouts out to Hope Village. But the only schools in the neighborhood were charters. And so for me as a community person, I want to live in the neighborhood that my kids go to school. I want to shop in the neighborhood that my kids go to school. I want to do all of those things in my community. And so the schools of choice for me were charter schools. There were no public schools for my kids to attend. Now they are in another district, but it's close to my workplace. But it's also a good school for them. Now, I think that when we think about like being able to choose charter schools, it is because there are certain things like I don't have to worry about if the bathroom smells like pee, because the infrastructure in the bathroom, no matter how much you clean it, it's so old that the pee smell doesn't come out. I don't have to worry about whether my kid may come home with bed bugs because this particular building still has carpet. So there's like small little infrastructure things that I think about and my kids' comfortability levels when I think about being in charters.
And that makes it harder to learn, because this is something that a lot of suburban districts or people who are listening to this in the suburbs, they just kind of take this for granted. Not that every school is perfect, not that there aren't issues, but it's kind of taken for granted. The concept of the cleanliness, the concept of the walkability, or 1,000%. Even just the drivability, whatever, it's near your subdivision. Mm-hmm. It's near you.
1,000%. So our youth did, they have a youth collective, and they were in one of their meetings, and their campaign right now is for school facilities. And so it was at their campaign launch party. And one of the things one of the students expressed was the fact that there are roaches in their school building. A student who was from a suburban district was like, well, why don't you just kill the bugs? And so those are the things.
It's that no matter what you do, you can't get around the problem, because the infrastructure itself is rotted.
Exactly. And why am I, a student, having to focus on getting rid of roaches in my school building? Is that my job? Absolutely not.
Well, and it shouldn't be, right?
It should not be. I should come to school to focus, to learn, and do all of the things that I'm in school to do. Also, not worrying about whether the ceiling tiles are going to fall on my head. That's not for our youth to focus on.
So what are some of the solutions we could work on to address this? Because I get that there are a lot of people who think, well, oh, it's over there or whatever. It's like not my problem. But at the end of the day, we are talking about children, and we're talking about human children. Exactly. And to me, it feels like an abdication of leadership to not address this in a meaningful way. So What are some of the more holistic solutions that you all are advocating for?
The way that the budget is done. Again, Detroit Public Schools cannot use their money for facilities. And so it's like, how do you change those rules and regulations so that they can have access to a better school facility? Because if I can't use my money for facilities, how will I ever change the infrastructure of a school that was built in 1920?
Right. And it hasn't been maintained.
It hasn't been
right,
maintained.
because there are districts that have older school buildings, but they had the resources the whole
because they
time.
can use their money for facilities.
Because they have that.
Exactly.
Is this a spot where maybe there's been a gap in the foundation community or something like that, where you see certain projects happening in areas? Does this get through to some residents' frustrations around, well, there's foundation money for this and that, but why not for me?
I think so. But I also think that like foundation money comes with rules and stipulations as well. And so
let's talk about that so people understand.
Yeah. So you can get money from a foundation. You can get a grant, a private donor, but oftentimes that money comes with, I need for you to fulfill X, Y, and Z in order for me to give you this money. And even if I get the money, if I have to fulfill these certain things, that means that I'm now being guided in the way in which that I can spend this money. And so oftentimes it's not directly for facilities, because I also believe that you can't raise money for facilities either. So how can I fix this if I can't raise money for it and use it, and if the money cannot be allocated in our budget? Whereas
you have some school districts that they have the foundation is separate from the school district, of course, but there is a board for it.
Exactly.
It's more of a community-led thing, and part of the issue with Detroit being, excuse my French, but so damn poor, is that when you have an average household income of 32 or 36 or whatever, there has been improvements, but it's still nowhere near enough to be functional.
Yes, exactly. Like, we don't make enough money to say, like, our wealthier school districts who can use their property taxes for their school districts, or who can have people donate a library or donate. There's one school that has a Chick-fil-A.
Wow. I did not know that.
So these are the gaps, right? Like, we're talking about students filling and being fed prison food. They look at their lunches and they know that this is not quality food.
Right. And it's not like Chick-fil-A is the healthiest thing in the world. But,
no, it's not the healthiest thing in the world.
But it's not.
But it's a step above prison food.
Right. And I think about the initiatives that some schools have done that have made improvements. In fact, I met up with Carla Hall. From the Food Network at a school in Detroit recently and interviewed her. And to see that kind of effort is big, but there was so much parent and other support in order to make that happen, in order to get somebody like Carla Hall to show up.
Yes. The biggest thing when it comes to changing anything in our school system is our parents have to be empowered to know that they are the thing that keeps this school running.
That's the truth in any school district, though, right?
It's the truth in any school district. But if I am in a suburban school district, I have a PTA. I may have parent liaisons. I may have all of these people behind me that empower me, that want to make a difference inside of the school. If I don't have a school that has something simple as a PTA, or I'm not in a school where I can walk in and be like, we need to fix this thing and my voice is heard, or I can't even get my voice heard about my own child's education. How can I feel empowered about making real life change inside of the school outside of my child? So
I can't help but think about the frustration that some people have felt around trying to change the system. And maybe part of the reason why you saw charters, I mean, there's multiple reasons why charters came to be, because there's a lot of political beliefs.
There's a lot of political beliefs. I have a whole PowerPoint about it.
And it gave the opportunity, that infrastructural and that structural problem gave the opportunity for that system to be tried. But what does an actual solution look like? Like, how do we actually address this?
For charters, and so I'm going to go back a little bit. Governor John Engler, he did an address, and he called our schools a monopoly of mediocrity. And in that address, he was basically introducing the idea of charter schools. And so from Engler, it went to Snyder. He followed up. Engler kind of threw him the ball, and then Snyder came and he took it to the home run. And so we see now what we have is a whole network of lack of transparency. And so when we think about like the things that need to, like, how can we change things? It's changing policy. It's changing legislation. It's making charter schools it's things like saying Detroit used to be what was called a first-class school district. And a first-class school district states that you have to have 100,000 students enrolled only in Detroit to be considered a first-class school district. But then they went back and they said, well, for money purposes, we'll make it 64,000. But Detroit public schools have been below 50,000 for years. And so we're not considered a first-class school district. And the caveat to that was, in order to be a first-class school district, if you are, charter schools cannot open. And so when we think about the game, the strategy, it was all very intentional.
So the focus isn't on the kids, it's on making the money.
Schools in Michigan are a business. We have people like Betsy DeVos, who has her hands all over charter schools. And that is the reason they're for profit, because they feed the wealthy people in Michigan.
I think there's only one nonprofit charter system.
I believe that it's Bay Mills because they're an Indian reservation.
Okay. Interesting. So it's not even about the mission. It's about the fact that it's an Indian reservation.
Yes. And so I believe that it's Bay Mills. There may be another one. I'll have to double check. But I believe that it is Bay Mills. But majority of them. So we have Ferris State, Grand Valley, Oakland University.
So you have the universities enabling a for-profit system.
Yes.
Where you have lots of people who are already billionaires making more money.
Yes.
Off of kids.
You have organizations like KIP, who run charter schools, where if you go and look at how much the CEO makes, you'll be appalled. There's no reason he should be making $1 million running a school district.
And when you look even at the well-heeled districts, again, to pick on Grosse Pointe or Birmingham or Bloomfield, those superintendents don't make $1 million.
Exactly.
They do well. They're not making $1 million.
I mean, they have a hard job to do, right?
Yeah.
But
I've interviewed a number of superintendents over the years.
But not $1 million.
Yeah. Which is CEO money.
Exactly.
Interesting. So what are ways that people at home can make some changes or encourage changes no matter where they are?
Yeah. So I think things like finding organizations like ours to be a part of, calling your legislators, posting about things that you see, donating to a local parent group. There's a lot of ways to go about being an advocate, but I think the first step is you have to feel empowered enough in order to do so.
There was an event you mentioned before we got on the air that I wanted to talk about. There's a Black Man Jubilee coming up around Juneteenth.
Yes. So I'm so excited about that. The Black Man Jubilee is going to be a mental health summit for Black men. I think one of the biggest gaps that we have in our mental health crisis is that Black men don't have resources. They don't have safe places. They don't have safe spaces to operate. And Black men are told that they shouldn't cry, they shouldn't feel, and that don't worry about your mental health. You're strong. You're okay. You can do it. And so the Jubilee is really focused on their well-being. I love you, Black men. I love them real bad. And I think their mental health is important because they're our leaders. They're our fathers. They're our educators. They are real people. And outside of just being strong, they have to take care of their internal because a lot of them are suffering.
It's a real challenge. And there's so much generational trauma that gets
1000%.
carried on. And people wonder, well, why did such and such do that? Or why did that weird thing happen? Well, if you know people, and I do know people, who have been through some of the most crazy things in their lives.
Yes.
Like I know somebody who literally their brother killed themselves in front of them.
Trauma.
Right? And that sticks with you. And there's even more research showing that like that sticks with you for generations.
Oh, 1000%.
When people say like something feels wrong like in my bones, and I've had that conversation so many times with friends, that's where it is.
It is. Generational trauma is real. Systemic trauma is real. Black people, since we have been in this country, we have faced trauma after trauma after trauma. Can you imagine what it is like as a man who is the provider and the protector of your family to watch your wife be raped in front of you, watch your kids snatched from you, and there's nothing you as a man can do about it, no matter how strong you are? Those traumas are real. Those traumas are generational.
And they've passed down.
When you think about things like, no, we're not in slavery anymore. We're in modern day slavery. And when you think about things as simple as Section 8, which is a government entity that was designed to keep Black men out of the home. As a woman on Section 8, you're not allowed to have a man in your home. But you have kids. And this man is their father. But because you get Section 8, he can't be in your home.
Is that a situation of marriage versus not marriage under the rules, or?
It is.
Okay.
And things like being married, they expect certain things from you. It's like, how are you married and you need to be on Section 8?
So the system reinforces the lack of Black men in children's and families' lives.
Exactly. Because if you remove the Black man from the home, what does that cause? That causes a whole nother level of issues. I'm a mom. I'm a woman. There are things that if I had a son, I cannot teach him. And a lot of people don't like to agree with it these days because I'm Black queer feminist. I love women, all of those things, right? But some things are just fact. I can't.
And it can be simple, like tying a tie.
Tying a tie.
Not that
I can do that.
Not that women can't do it, but so often
different.
It's those kinds of rites of passage of spending that time.
Exactly. Now my daughters, I got that. But my daughters still need their father. Because when they don't have their father, who's going to teach them how to be loved by a man? Who's going to teach them how a man should treat you if they're not seeing me being loved properly? It's so many levels.
Well, the idea being normalized that, my mom raised me, so I can do my own. Like it helps reinforce the disintegration of the family.
It does. And for me, I think about a lot of times with, so I'm married now. I've been married for 3 years. But my children before that, I never aspired to be a single parent household. But because mental health is real, and because he went through a cycle of depression, anxiety, that created all of these other things in our dynamic of our relationship, you can't traumatize an already traumatized person. And so I have to remove myself from this situation now. But because we're such a traumatized people, we're just walking around here traumatizing each other. And that doesn't work. Because he didn't have the resources that he needed to be okay. His brother died.
Yeah.
And he was never okay after that. And so, like, if he had the resources in place, he might have been a different person. He might have been able to handle that differently. And the things that occurred probably would not have. But there are no immediate resources. Therapy that's a monolith in our community.
And you think about the mental health system in Metro Detroit and Michigan. You talked about Engler. A lot of it was disassembled.
Exactly.
And then there are some organizations trying to do things, but it's such an overwhelming problem.
Yes.
That there's just not enough for anything. Mix that along with the lack of health care, the disparities among doctors, all that kind of stuff.
All of those things. And then just because I have a therapist doesn't mean that that's the therapist for me. I can have a therapist, but that doesn't mean that she or he understands my struggles as a Black man or a Black woman.
It's very difficult to find a new therapist. And
it's extremely difficult to find a new therapist. It's like speed dating. It's like, so what do you like? What do you do?
Shout out to the therapists I know in my life. I know a few of them.
Yes.
And it is difficult. And the amount of stress that they go under taking this over, like, it just feels like a system that under the best of situations is difficult. Even if you've got the money, even if you've got the resources, you've broken out or whatever, and it's like, hey, I can write whatever checks I want. It's still difficult.
It's still difficult, extremely difficult. And then you think about things like the simple part of a copay. If I have to see my therapist every week and my copay is $50, that's $200. Do I have an extra $200 for this if I'm living paycheck to paycheck? Absolutely not. Do I have $200 for this if I'm only making $10 an hour? Absolutely not. And so it's inaccessible. And then the therapists that are free or organizations that do offer those type of services, you have to know to find them.
And that ties into another thread that we talked about on the show about the Detroit Policy Conference and things like that, where Michigan, 6 in 10 Michigan jobs don't pay a living wage.
They do not. They do not.
So that is, if you're not making a living wage, you're not getting access to all these other things.
Listen, but then there's a nuance to that because there's no middle class anymore. And so if you are, let's say you are making $55,000 a year, you're poor because you don't make enough to be comfortable, but you make too much to receive any help. So it's like a catch-22. What am I going to do?
I think, too, one thing that gets discounted by some people, and I've had this debate with listeners before, where they're like, well, you're making $55,000, $60,000 a year. Well, it's very different if you have parents that have wealth themselves.
Exactly.
It's very different when you have parents that can put down the money for a down payment, or it's like, oh,
Now
well,
you preaching.
they should just go ahead and buy a house. You know, it's more expensive because now it's actually more expensive to rent than buy in payments here in Metro Detroit.
It is.
But the problem is getting into that house in the first place with the high interest rate. And it's one thing if your parents have the ability to be like, hey, let's put down that 20% down payment or whatever that needs to come together, versus somebody who's trying to make it and like, yes, they make 55 grand or yes, they make 60 grand, but they are completely reliant on everything. And they have so much almost like lifetime debt, maybe not an actual debt, maybe it's actual debt like student loans, but lifetime debt of things that just weren't done for them over the years where they're just not at the same level. And that's part of why we have the part of the income inequality that we do that is exacerbated here in Detroit and urban areas around the country.
1,000%. 1,000%. Agree.
So this Jubilee, how can people get involved with it?
It is Juneteenth again. If you are interested in being a donor, a sponsor, you're interested in offering a service, you can always email me at Tinu, TINU, at the numbers 482 and the word forward.org.
And if people want to learn more about what you're doing, that's the same place they can reach you, 482 Forward.
Yes, definitely check out our Instagram, Facebooks, Twitter, all of that, 482 Forward. And then you can check out YVAC MI.
Tinu Usoro, thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming by. And let's do this again. And I invite people, dailydetroit@gmail.com or 313-789-3211. If you've got thoughts, experiences, things that you want to share, I want to hear about it because I think this is a very real conversation we had about education in Michigan.
Yes, I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our conversation today.